That last song happens to be one of my favorites. So Jonathan asked me, what to sing this week, and I didn't give him any suggestions, so I don't know, it just must have been connected or something, so appreciate it. I had a great Thanksgiving week, and we did not forget to set our scales back 15 pounds. I hope that all of you did the same. So we're feeling all right, but we have truly been blessed. Thankfulness is just critically important, and I think that as you think about all the things that God has given us, you can't help but be thankful. There's that song, when upon life's billows you are tempest tossed, when you are discouraged thinking all is lost, what do? You count your blessings. And as we do that, we come to realize that we have been given a whole awful lot. And every day is filled with things that God is doing for us. Through the good times and through the bad times, He's just been good to us. And one of the great things that we have been given as Christians is salvation, and we've been given His Word. And as we take a look at His Word, we learn things about how we are to live and how we can actually live in gratitude and how we can live a life that is worth living. We are in the book of Mark. And we are in this confrontation section, and really, as we take a look at chapter 7, it comes kind of out of nowhere in a lot of ways, but there is precedent for this in the book of Mark. We saw a confrontation earlier in the book of Mark when he had 5 instances of this conflict that he was having with various people, and we see this also in chapter 7 in Mark as he has moved through chapters 5 and 6 and talked about what Jesus is doing and about all the wonderful things that he is proving to people about his messiahship and about his lordship and about the fact that he is God incarnate. Although we have not come to the point where we have a confession yet in terms of those things, we see that Jesus constantly has a plan in mind. It is all about kingdom expansion. It is all about making sure that that kingdom does expand. But he does run into conflict. He does run into difficulty. And so we are looking at the bulk of chapter 7 today. We are not going to read the entire thing, but we are looking at verses 1 through 23, and we're going to be looking at some of what is going on and picking out various key passages here. But I would just simply like to read verses 1 through 8. And it says, "The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean, that is, ceremonially unwashed hands. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, 'Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands?' He replied, 'Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men.'" And I take a look at this particular passage and what is going on here, and really what we have with these Pharisees and these teachers of the law that have come down from Jerusalem is an accusation. It is an accusation about what is going on, and they're coming to Jesus and they're seeing some things and they're saying, "Jesus, you are breaking with convention. You are breaking with what should be happening." Now it's interesting that Mark talks about all of this, and he's needing to explain some things. Mark talks about this and he says, "The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing." And when he's saying this, we have to recognize that Mark's audience is not Jewish, and so he is doing an awful lot of explanation as he is talking about the ceremonial washing and how they don't come from the marketplace unless they wash their hands. I think I'd make a good Jew at this point, because I don't put food in my mouth unless I wash my hands. I don't do that. But this was a little bit of a different thing, where they are ceremonially doing this, and they are doing this in such a way that it has to be done in a certain way. And when Mark says, "The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing," we have a situation in which here we have at least a little bit of a group of Jews who are not doing that. And we have to understand that what is going on here is this was something that the elders and the Pharisees held on to very tightly. This is what we do. This is what we make sure that we do. And we can say that we are keeping the law perfectly, which no one keeps the law perfectly, but we can say that we're keeping the law perfectly. We're doing exactly what we should be doing. We are engaging in a certain type of piety here, making sure that we are okay. And maybe we are doing it better than our fellow countrymen. So when it says all the Jews, it's those people who are trying to be observant. And so Jesus, as a teacher, has disciples around him. And maybe not every Jew in Israel washes their hands the way that they should be, but those people who should be doing that, at least, are those who have a rabbi who is discipling them. Do we understand that? It's kind of like, okay, maybe not everyone's doing it, but your disciples at least should be. Because Jesus, you should be teaching them these things, and you are not. And so what we have here is we have a certain tone that is accusatory in nature, that is going through this in nature. And I think that what we have here again is we have to remind ourselves. We have to remind ourselves that Jesus is always about kingdom expansion. He's always about making sure that everyone hears the good news of the coming kingdom. He wants to make sure that everyone has a chance to repent. Remember, that's what he came to do. And he's constantly leaving crowds behind because they're wanting him to do something different than what he is trying to accomplish. And so he's always trying to expand his kingdom. And so what we have here is Mark, he's talking about, okay, I want you to understand what Jews do, because my audience, Mark is writing, is not Jewish. They're not thinking about these things. And so the people who are listening to these are going, what is that all about? Why is this a controversy? What is going on? And Mark, really, what he is doing in this particular passage right here is he is setting us up for 7:24 through the end of the chapter. When Jesus goes into the area of Syrophoenicia, to the area of Tyre, to the area of Sidon, to the area of the Decapolis, to non-Jewish areas. And he is interacting with non-Jewish people. Why? Because he is always interested in kingdom expansion. And so Mark, he's setting this up saying, okay, you don't understand some things, but guess what? He is setting it up because what's going to happen is he's going to go to other places that are, quote unquote, unclean. Okay? So we have this. Now, the Pharisees come at Jesus. I don't know how you are when you are accused of something. I don't know how you react when somebody points out something that is uncomfortable to you, or maybe that you are not doing the way that they think that you should be doing it. I have a tendency to get defensive. That's not what Jesus did. He actually goes on the offensive, and we can see this right here when he talks about this. He replied. How did he reply in verse 6? Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. Jesus is not afraid to call a spade. And what we have going on here is Jesus making sure that they understand some things, and he is understanding their tone. He is understanding what they are doing, and he is saying, you are listening. You say that you are listening to God, but really you are listening to men. And that's what we have in verses 6 and 7 and 8. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of people. And why would we trade God's word for tradition? What is going on here in all this? And I think about this, and I think about, okay, here we have the chosen people of Israel. Okay? They have dealt with several different epics in their lives. And what is going on in the Exodus is one thing, and they weren't faithful in the desert, and they fell, and then they entered the promised land. The generation after them entered the promised land, and they had that time of being in the promised land where they were faithful to God, and they were unfaithful to God, and they were faithful to God, and they were unfaithful to God. And finally, God sends armies against them. He sends nations against them. They are dragged away into captivity, and they come back in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, for example. And they come back, and what is interesting about that particular area is if you take a look at how Israel lived after the exile, they put away the idols for good. They put away the false gods for good. And they started living in a way that God wanted them to do. But what it was also this way of saying, we want to make sure that we stay away from evil as much as possible. And so what they started to do is they started building walls and expanding out to protect themselves from falling into temptation and from falling into ways that they should not be thinking. And in a way, what they did was they said, okay, well, if God says this, that we need to make sure that we're clean, we're going to make sure that we're clean. It's kind of like Peter, when Jesus washes his feet, and Peter says, I don't want to have any part of this, and Jesus says, if I don't do this, then you have no part of me. And then he says, well, wash my whole body. And Jesus says, no, you don't need your whole body clean, you just need part of it clean. But what's going on is there's an overabundance, there's this over-enthusiasm for doing things in a certain way. I don't have this passage written down, and I meant to, so basically if you're taking notes or something like that, you can take a look at Colossians, the 2nd chapter, verses 20 through the end. And Paul is dealing with a situation, and he says, since you died with Christ to the basic principles of this world, why, as though you still belong to it, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These are all destined to perish with use because they are based on human commands and teachings. That's that human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have the appearance of wisdom, where their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body. But they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. And so what we have here, I think, is an overabundance of caution in this particular situation. I also think that there is a certain stubborn nature in all of this. If we take a look at the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah is writing in the time of the kings. He is writing before the exile. He is talking with kings and princes, and he's talking with the people, and he's trying to make sure that people are doing the right thing. And so they're not necessarily listening to what God is saying. But the Lord speaks to Ahaz in verse 10 of chapter 7 of Isaiah. And God says himself, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. Okay, we understand this? God is saying, ask me for a sign. And what does Ahaz say? Ahaz says, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Well, okay, you got this regulation, you got this thing that Jesus even quoted when he was talking to Satan, don't put the Lord your God to a test. Ahaz, he knows that much. But you got God himself saying, put me to the test here. That is an exception. If God says to do something, then you do it. He says, I'm not going to do this. And Isaiah says, hear now the house of David. Is it not enough for you to try the patience of men when you try the patience of my God also? And then we have one of those wonderful passages that talks about the coming of the Messiah. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child, and he will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. And so we have this thing, and I think sometimes there's this stubbornness in us that we say, you know what? I just want to do it my way. I want to do it my way, and I'll justify it any way that I can. And I'll justify it and say what I'm doing is I'm keeping myself pure, and I'm making sure that I am doing the right thing in this particular way. And that way I can say, hey, I'm perfect in this way. I'll give you an example from my own life. Okay, I don't cuss. It's just not something I've ever done. I did cuss one time and checked because I didn't know what the word was. And so I used it. My wife looked at me like, what are you doing? And so I learned, okay, well, that's not a word that you say, but I just don't do it. I know plenty of Christians who have said things that are not cuss words. How do you say that? Okay? I cannot rely on the fact that I don't cuss to say that I'm getting to heaven. I can't rely on that. It's a safeguard that I put in place for myself. But I can't say that because of my own righteousness and because of my own keeping of my tongue, that somehow I am better and getting to heaven on my own merit. I can't do that. And yet, what we do so many times is, in our stubbornness, we say, I am not going to cross this line, and it becomes not only stubbornness, it also becomes a sense of pride, and it allows for our own downfall in other areas of our lives. We've got to be very careful of that. That's what's going on here. They are doing this one thing, putting aside what God has said clearly, and doing what is not right. But also I think that we do love loopholes, and all of us love loopholes. Our kids love loopholes. Well, you didn't say that. Yeah, but do I have to say everything that you're not supposed to do? Jesus says, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and if anyone curses his father or mother, he must be put to death. Honor your father and mother. Well, guess what? That's one of the big 10, isn't it? But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is korban, that is a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father and mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And you do many things like that. And we go, well, okay, what is this korban thing? What in the world is going on with that? Imagine this. Imagine that I have an extra car. Okay? And I have this extra car, and I say, you know what? I'm going to dedicate this to God. And my parents come to me and they say, son, our car just broke down. Can we borrow your car? And I say, you can't borrow that car because I've dedicated that to God. That's for church purposes, if anyone in the church needs it. We recognize that as ridiculous, but that's exactly what is going on here. That's what korban was. It's not like they were giving it away or anything like that or whatever that thing was. It was, Mom and Dad, I can't help you with this money because I have set it aside for God's purposes. Or Mom and Dad, I can't help you with whatever else it is because I have set it aside for God's purposes. Certainly not honoring Mom and Dad. We like those loopholes. We like to say, I've got this situation where I can do what I want to with it, not what you want me to do with it. We like that. So what is going on here? Jesus, he wants to tell them something, and he wants to talk to them about clean versus unclean, because really what we have here is we have a situation where we really have to deal with this particular situation. And Jesus, in verse 14, he says, again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me. This smacks of 127, where Jesus is teaching, and people look at him and says, what kind of teaching is this? It is a teaching with authority. Jesus is saying, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. It is an all-points bulletin that I'm the one that you should be listening to here. And he says, really what we have here in this particular situation when we are talking about clean versus unclean is a proof that is actually in the proverbial pudding. And so we have things in verse 15. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. What is going on here? In verse 20, he says, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. So what we have here is what exactly is clean and what is unclean. It has nothing to do with what you actually put in your body. It has nothing to do with that at all. It has what is the motivations of your heart. What is going on there? When we take a look at we'll get to that in just a second, but we take a look at this and we have this very interesting passage where it says, again, in verse 19, for it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body. And then Mark says, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. That seems like a footnote. It seems like an aside. It sounds like something, what's going on here, but I want to point out two things to that. First, where is Mark getting his source material for the writing of his gospel? We've talked about this before. I'm almost halfway tempted to have you tell me what that is. Anybody remember? Peter, right? Peter is his father in the faith. He spent a lot of time with Peter. He spent a lot of time listening to Peter. A lot of what he is getting is from Peter. And so we have Mark who is expressing this. How in the world might Mark understand this from Peter's perspective? Well, he may understand it from Acts chapter 10, the story of Cornelius. We remember the story of Cornelius, what was happening there? Cornelius is a Gentile, and he has a vision from God that he is supposed to send for Peter. And so Peter, he is out there on the roof of his house praying, and he becomes hungry, and he wants something to eat, and he falls into a trance. And he saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down from earth by its four corners, and it contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles of the earth and birds of the air. And a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." This happens 3 times, and then he gets a knock on the door from Cornelius' house. And Peter goes ahead and follows Cornelius. And what we find him saying to Cornelius when he finally gets into Cornelius' house, he says, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or visit him. But God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean." And so we have this situation where I think what Mark is doing is he is remembering what Peter told him about all these things, and he's going back. And Peter, he's going back in his brain, and he's saying, you know what? Jesus said something a while back when he was walking this earth before his crucifixion. And what he said was, it doesn't go into his heart but into his stomach and then out of his body. And you know, Mark, what Jesus meant by that is he was declaring all foods clean. And he was giving Mark a practical lesson in what or how you interpret what Jesus was saying. And we have to remember again, who was Mark's audience? And so when he gets into verse 24 through the end of this chapter, who is Jesus dealing with? Gentiles. Guess what? This good news is for everybody. But the major part that we have to understand about all of what Jesus is saying here is, what is the condition of your heart? And that becomes crucially important in all of this. You've got these Pharisees and these teachers of the law who are holding on to traditions of people, who are putting aside God's commands and not doing what is right. They are living a hypocritical life, doing things that they ought not to do, building walls around rules that actually don't let them get into the actual heart of what God is. And so he says, it doesn't go into his heart but into his stomach, and then it goes out of his body. So the heart is the important thing. And so we get into verse 21 again, for from within, out of men's hearts come the evil thoughts and all of these things. So really what we are talking about here is a matter of the heart. And as we take a look at what our lives are, it is always a matter of the heart. What is coming out of us is what makes us either clean or unclean. I think sometimes we have to evaluate what we are doing. And again, that may be an understatement, isn't it? We always need to be evaluating what we are doing. We have brothers and sisters here that are wonderful people and constantly are drawing us back to this. Conversations that we have after church are always drawing us back to this and saying, what does this say? How are we supposed to live according to what this is saying? How do we do this? How do we make sure that we are living in the right way? And as we take a look at our lives and we see, okay, what part of our lives are we not giving up to God? What part of our lives are we looking for loopholes in? What part of our lives are we building in rules for ourselves that are not of God, but rather of people? We can take a look at our lives and say, okay, I am looking at this and I am making sure that I am following what God wants me to do instead of what people want me to do. Every single week we offer an invitation, and one of the things we have to understand about this invitation is that it is open to all, for all time, all the time, for as long as we have breath. And we offer an invitation to come and join in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ through the waters of baptism, to go in an old sinner and come up a new creation. And we do all this. But we have to recognize all of this. We do this because it is actually what God has commanded us to do. But we also have to remember what the purpose of this is. We also have to remember that this is also a matter of the heart, that it is also a matter of our conscience. And so in 1 Peter 3:21, it talks about this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. And so we do this because it is crucial that we do this, to fulfill all righteousness and to do all of that. But it is not the removal of dirt from the body. It is not a ceremonial washing. There is nothing magical about the water. But it is a pledge. It is a pledge of a good conscience. In other words, I am giving God my heart and saying, I am dedicating myself to you at this point, from this point on, and I am giving myself wholly to you. It is a pledge of a good conscience before God. And it saves you not by any kind of magic or anything like that, but rather by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. And so again, we offer this invitation for anybody who would wish to be his child this morning. Please come as we stand and sing.